My name is Kira, and I am 33 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As the founder of a crisis management firm, I escaped their toxicity by building a corporate empire from the ground up. 10 years ago, days before my 23rd birthday, my mother called to cancel our plans because my sister broke a nail and needed emotional support. My father texted me to just be the strong one. It was a pattern I could no longer ignore, so I packed my bags, walked out the door, and never looked back. But last Tuesday, they tried to kick me out of my own private corporate event, completely unaware that I was holding the keys to their destruction. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who severely underestimated your worth. Growing up in an affluent suburb of Boston, my life was a constant exercise in making myself small. My parents, Howard and Catherine, owned a mid-sized logistics firm and poured every ounce of their affection, resources, and attention into my younger sister Felicity. I was the scapegoat, the quiet one expected to absorb their stress and accommodate Felicity's endless drama. But that was a lifetime ago. On a crisp morning in early October, I sat on the private dining terrace of the Wellington, one of Boston's most exclusive luxury hotels. The terrace offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline, but my focus was entirely on the documents spread across the pristine white tablecloth. As the CEO of Apex Crisis Management, I was in the final stages of closing a massive merger for a high-profile tech client. The air was calm, smelling faintly of expensive espresso and fresh linen. I took a deep breath, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction. I had rented the entire terrace for the morning to ensure absolute privacy and security for my client, who was due to arrive in exactly 15 minutes. I smoothed my tailored blazer and reviewed the non-disclosure agreements, feeling completely in control of my universe. That perfect tranquility shattered in an instant. A shrill, unmistakable voice pierced through the quiet elegance of the dining area, echoing off the glass walls. "I do not care who is sitting there. I want that table for my bridal shower brunch. Tell whoever it is to move right now." My pen froze over the paperwork. I knew that voice. Even after 10 years of absolute silence, the petulant, demanding tone of my sister Felicity was etched permanently into my memory. I slowly lifted my gaze toward the grand entrance of the terrace. There she was, dressed in an ostentatious white designer outfit, waving her hands frantically at the panicked maitre d'. Standing just a few steps behind her were my parents, Howard and Catherine, looking exactly as I remembered them, polished, hovering, and completely devoted to soothing whatever minor inconvenience had upset their golden child. The maitre d' kept his voice low and professional, trying to block their path. "I am incredibly sorry, miss, but the entire terrace has been reserved for a private corporate event. We have a wonderful table in the main dining room." Felicity stamped her foot, a gesture that was pathetic on a 30-year-old woman. "I do not want the main dining room. I want the terrace view for my photos. Just pay the woman off and make her leave." As Felicity pushed past the hotel staff and marched onto the terrace, her eyes locked onto me. For a split second, she did not register who I was. I had left home as a broke, exhausted 23-year-old wearing thrift store clothes. The woman sitting before her was a confident executive in a power suit. But as she marched closer, recognition finally dawned on her perfectly contoured face. Her jaw dropped. "Kira," she gasped, her voice dripping with absolute disdain. "What on earth are you doing here?" My parents rushed up behind her, breathless from trying to keep up. When Catherine saw me, the color drained from her cheeks, but the shock quickly morphed into her default state of management and manipulation. Instead of a heartfelt reunion after a decade apart, my mother immediately slipped right back into the old toxic dynamic. "Kira," Catherine said, sighing, as if my mere presence was an exhausting burden. "What are you doing here? Look, your sister is incredibly stressed about her wedding, and this is her special day. Be the strong one and give up the table. We will buy you a cup of coffee downstairs and catch up later." My father stepped forward, crossing his arms and looking down at me with the same disapproving glare that had haunted my childhood. "Let us not make a scene," Kira Howard ordered. "You are embarrassing your sister in a public place. Take $100, go find a diner across the street, and let Felicity have this space. Her guests will be arriving soon. I did not flinch. I did not shrink. The little girl who used to crave their validation was long dead, replaced by a woman who managed corporate disasters for a living. I calmly capped my pen, placed it perfectly parallel to my client's contract, and took a slow, deliberate sip of my espresso. Then I looked up at the three people who had caused me so much pain. I am not moving, I said, my voice steady and dangerously quiet. Felicity let out a dramatic scoff, turning to our mother like a petulant toddler. Mom, make her move. She is doing this on purpose just to ruin my bridal aura. She is trespassing in the members section anyway. Just as my father reached into his wallet to throw cash at me, the general manager of the Wellington hurried onto the terrace, flanked by two security guards. I caught the manager's eye and gave a subtle, precise nod. I apologize for the intrusion, Ms. Wilson, the manager said, bowing his head respectfully to me before turning a stern glare upon my family. Sir, madam, I must ask you to leave this area immediately. Howard puffed out his chest, attempting to use his country club authority. Now see here, we are willing to compensate this young woman for her table. My daughter is having a bridal shower. The manager did not back down. You do not understand, sir. Ms. Wilson did not simply book a table. She has rented the entire terrace for the day for a highly classified corporate event. Furthermore, as a minority stakeholder in the hospitality group that owns this hotel, she dictates who is permitted on these premises. You are trespassing on her private event. The blood drained from my father's face. Felicity's mouth opened and closed in silent shock, her eyes darting from the manager to the security guards. Catherine tried to reach out toward me, her voice suddenly trembling. Kira, you own part of this hotel. I stood up, smoothing the front of my blazer, and looked directly into my sister's panicked eyes. I do, and your guest passes are officially revoked for creating a public disturbance. The security guards stepped forward gently but firmly, guiding my parents and sister toward the exit. Felicity began to scream, her carefully crafted image shattering completely. You selfish nobody, she shrieked, struggling against the guard's outstretched arm. You always ruin everything for me. I walked slowly toward the glass doors, watching them being herded toward the elevator. 10 years ago, I said, my voice carrying clearly over her hysterics, you left me sitting alone at an empty table on my 23rd birthday because Felicity broke a nail. You told me to be the strong one. I promised myself that night I would never let you dictate where I sit again. Have a wonderful brunch in the lobby. The elevator doors slid shut, cutting off Felicity's enraged screams and leaving me in absolute perfect peace. But that peace was briefly interrupted. By the time I returned to my table, my phone was already buzzing in my pocket. It was a voicemail from my father, left the exact second he stepped out of the hotel and onto the street. I pressed play and held the speaker close to my ear, listening to his heavy breathing. His voice was thick with deep condescension, completely lacking any self-awareness or regret. He complained bitterly that I was still holding a grudge over a simple birthday dinner from a decade ago. He told my mother loudly enough for the microphone to catch every single word that I had not changed at all since I was a stubborn teenager. I could hear Catherine in the background agreeing with him, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy as she tried to soothe my hysterical sister. Catherine confidently stated that I was obviously just a glorified assistant who had booked a nice table for a wealthy boss and was now abusing a tiny bit of corporate power to punish my family for no logical reason. They genuinely believed I was nothing more than a lowly secretary playing pretend in a world I did not belong in. I deleted the voicemail with a slow swipe of my finger, completely unbothered by their profound delusion. My client arrived moments later, and the rest of my day proceeded with flawless precision. The scene shifted dramatically the very next morning. I arrived at the sleek downtown headquarters of Apex Solutions at 6 in the morning. As the founder and CEO of Boston's premier crisis management firm, my days were usually scheduled down to the absolute minute. My firm specialized in containing corporate disasters, sealing massive financial leaks, and executing aggressive cybersecurity audits. We were the exact people that billionaires called when their companies were teetering on the brink of absolute public ruin. I sat behind my expansive mahogany desk, watching the city wake up through the pristine floor-to-ceiling windows when my executive assistant knocked softly on the heavy wooden door. She held a thick red file and looked unusually tense for so early in the morning. She walked over and informed me that we had received a frantic high-priority inquiry from a mid-sized logistics company currently facing a catastrophic public relations nightmare. The details she outlined were absolutely staggering. Millions of dollars were missing from their core operating accounts, leaving the business completely paralyzed. A massive vendor leak was actively threatening to hit the mainstream press by the end of the week, which would destroy whatever remained of their fragile reputation. To make matters infinitely worse, they were facing an imminent and highly aggressive investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission. The company was bleeding out rapidly, and the owners were absolutely desperate. They needed the best crisis team in the city to step in and stop the bleeding before the federal authorities shut them down for good and sent someone to federal prison. I calmly asked my assistant for the name of the logistics company. When she said the name aloud, my blood ran cold, though I kept my facial expression perfectly neutral. It was my parents' company. It was the exact same logistics firm that had funded Felicity's lavish lifestyle and endless unreasonable demands for the past 30 years. The irony was almost poetic in its perfection. Less than 24 hours after they had mocked me as a low-level assistant and demanded I surrender my seat for my spoiled sister, they were begging my corporate firm for their salvation. I instructed my assistant to clear my entire morning schedule and bring them up to my personal office the second they arrived in the lobby. I did not tell her they were my estranged family. I simply told her they were a highly sensitive acquisition that required my direct supervision. While I waited for their scheduled arrival, I carefully reviewed the preliminary data my cyber team had managed to pull together overnight. The logistics company was in far worse shape than my parents probably even realized. The financial discrepancies were not just minor accounting errors or simple oversights. They were glaring massive holes in the ledger that indicated years of systemic mismanagement or outright deliberate fraud. I thought about how Howard had always prided himself on his supposed business acumen. He used his company as a heavy shield, a constant symbol of his unquestionable authority and social status in our suburban neighborhood. He had always treated me as an unworthy investment because I did not fit his rigid traditional mold of corporate success. Yet here was his glorious legacy actively crumbling into dust beneath the weight of its own incompetence. The tension in my office built gradually as the clock ticked closer to their appointment time. I felt no anxiety, only a cold, sharp, and unwavering focus. I swiveled my high-backed leather chair around to face the panoramic window, presenting my back directly to the heavy wooden door. I wanted them to walk into the room without any mental preparation, without any warning of who they were about to face. I wanted them to experience the full, unfiltered reality of the power dynamic they had just walked blindly into. At precisely 9 o'clock, the heavy oak doors of my office swung open with a soft click. I could hear the frantic, uneven pacing of my father's footsteps against the polished hardwood floor. My mother's voice was a breathless, nervous whisper as she profusely thanked my assistant for fitting them in on such incredibly short notice. Howard immediately launched into his carefully rehearsed pitch, his voice projecting the false confidence of a desperate man trying desperately to maintain his slipping authority. He demanded to speak to the CEO, directly insisting that their complex financial situation required the absolute highest level of discretion and immediate aggressive action. He casually mentioned his country club connections and dropped the names of several prominent local businessmen actively trying to leverage non-existent goodwill to secure our elite services. I let him speak to the back of my chair for a full, uninterrupted minute. I let him lay out the miserable, broken state of his life's work, detailing the missing funds and the looming, terrifying threat of the business press. He sounded deeply exhausted, completely stripped of the arrogant entitlement he had displayed just yesterday at the luxury hotel. When he finally paused to take a ragged breath, assuming he was speaking to some faceless, older corporate savior who would magically fix his problems, I placed my hands firmly on the armrests of my chair. I slowly pushed my feet against the floor, allowing the heavy leather chair to swivel around in a smooth, deliberate, and terrifyingly silent motion. I stopped exactly when I was facing them, directly across the wide expanse of my desk. Howard and Catherine stood frozen in the center of the expansive office like statues. The color instantly drained from my father's weathered face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. Catherine's mouth fell completely open, her eyes darting wildly from my calm face to the expensive curated artwork on the walls, and finally coming to rest on the solid gold nameplate sitting perfectly centered on my desk. It read, Kira Founder and Chief Executive Officer. The reality of their grim situation crashed down upon them in real time. The abandoned daughter they had casually dismissed as a pathetic failure just yesterday was now the solitary person holding the ultimate power to save their entire livelihood from absolute destruction. They had absolutely nowhere left to run. Their perfect illusion was finally over forever. The silence that filled the room was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. They were stunned into total, terrifying silence. The silence stretched on, thick and oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the city traffic drifting up through the thick glass windows. I watched my parents process the impossible reality sitting right in front of them. Howard stood frozen, his jaw completely slack, staring at my gold nameplate as if it were a bomb waiting to detonate. Catherine looked like she had seen a ghost. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her expensive designer handbag against her chest. For an entire decade, they had convinced themselves I was struggling, a tragic cautionary tale of rebellion that they could use to make themselves look like long-suffering, patient parents. Now the sheer magnitude of my success was laid bare, entirely contradicting the pathetic narrative they had spent years carefully constructing for their country club friends. Howard opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He closed it, swallowed hard, and looked around my expansive office again, as if hoping to find a hidden camera or some indication that this was an elaborate, cruel prank. But there was no prank. There was only me sitting in a chair that cost more than my childhood bedroom furniture, wearing a tailored suit that projected absolute, unapologetic authority. Catherine was the first to recover from the initial shock. I watched the gears turning in her head. Instead of apologizing for the atrocious way she had treated me the previous day, or expressing even a fraction of an ounce of pride at what her daughter had built from absolutely nothing, her survival instincts kicked into high gear. Her face transformed rapidly from genuine horror to an expression of manufactured, sickeningly sweet relief. She let out a dramatic, breathless gasp and took a step toward my desk, her eyes lighting up with a sudden, opportunistic gleam. Kira, she exclaimed, her voice pitching up into that familiar, grating tone of artificial affection she always used when she wanted something from me. This is absolutely perfect. I cannot believe it. Our own daughter is the CEO of Apex Solutions. Oh, Howard, do you see this? This is an absolute miracle. She turned to my father, grabbing his arm and shaking it slightly, trying to snap him out of his stunned paralysis. Howard finally blinked, pulling his gaze away from my nameplate to look at my face. He straightened his posture desperately, trying to summon the authoritative, patriarchal tone he had always used to keep me in line. Well, he started, his voice rough and uneven. I suppose this explains why you were at the Wellington yesterday. You should have simply told us who you were working for. I am not working for anyone, Howard. I corrected him, my voice completely flat and devoid of any familial warmth. I own the firm. You are standing in my building. Catherine ignored my coldness entirely. She leaned over my desk, her eyes wide and pleading, attempting to bridge a 10-year gap of neglect with a single desperate smile. Kira, you have to help us, she begged, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. The company is in terrible danger. We are facing an absolute public relations nightmare, and if this vendor leak hits the press, your father could face an investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission. You know how hard we have worked for everything we have. You owe us for raising you, Kira. Family helps family. We need you to step in, use your team, and bury this entire story for free. We need to save the company, and more importantly, we need to save Felicity's inheritance and her wedding. I sat back in my leather chair, steepling my fingers together. I simply stared at her, marveling at the sheer, unadulterated audacity of her request. Not even 24 hours ago, she had demanded I leave a hotel terrace so my sister could take photos. Now she wanted me to deploy a multi-million-dollar cybersecurity and crisis management team to save that exact same sister's trust fund, entirely free of charge, all under the guise of family loyalty. "You owe us," Howard chimed in, finding his footing as he sensed an opening to assert his dominance. "We gave you a roof over your head and paid for your early education. We are your parents. You will assemble your best people right now, find out who is leaking our financial data, and shut them down before the authorities get involved. We can keep this entirely off the books. No one even needs to know we hired you." I let his demands hang in the air for a long, uncomfortable moment. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger or resentment. I simply opened the top drawer of my desk and retrieved a thick, professionally bound legal document. I placed it perfectly in the center of the desk, right next to a sleek silver pen. "I do not work for family," I said, my tone as sharp and unyielding as cut glass. "I work for Apex Solutions, and Apex Solutions does not do favors, nor do we operate off the books." I tapped my index finger against the heavy cardstock cover of the document. "This is our standard crisis intervention contract. It requires a $500,000 upfront retainer payable by wire transfer within the next hour. It also grants my cybersecurity team full, unrestricted, and absolute access to every single server, financial ledger, and internal communication system your logistics company possesses. We will trace the missing funds, we will identify the source of the leak, and we will compile a comprehensive forensic report." Catherine gasped, her hand flying to her chest. $500,000. "Kira, we are your family. We cannot afford that right now. The company accounts are completely locked up because of the missing money. You cannot possibly expect your own parents to pay that kind of extortionate fee." I looked at her without a trace of sympathy. "You were perfectly willing to pay me $100 to eat at a diner yesterday, Catherine. Today my price is $500,000. Howard slammed his fist down on the edge of my desk. A weak attempt at physical intimidation that did absolutely nothing to move me. "This is outrageous. You are trying to bankrupt us out of spite. I will not sign over complete access to my servers to a vindictive child. I will go to another firm. I will find someone who respects me." "Go ahead," I challenged softly, maintaining unbroken eye contact. "Walk out that door. By tomorrow morning, the news outlets will publish the vendor leak. By Friday, the federal authorities will raid your corporate offices. You will lose your business, your home, and Felicity will not have a single dime for her lavish wedding. Sign the contract, Howard, or enjoy federal prison. The choice is entirely yours." My father stared at me, his chest heaving with barely suppressed rage. He looked at my mother, who was silently weeping, nodding frantically for him to comply. His entire empire was collapsing, and I was his only remaining lifeline. With shaking hands, Howard picked up the silver pen. He flipped to the final page and scrawled his signature across the dotted line, sealing his fate. I pressed a button on my desk phone, summoning my lead forensics director. I handed him the signed contract and authorized the immediate data extraction. My team worked with ruthless efficiency. Within 3 hours, they had bypassed my father's outdated firewalls and began pulling the financial logs. But as the data poured in, the narrative shifted abruptly. The massive financial leak was not the result of an external hacker. It was a highly coordinated inside job. The sheer scale of the deception became brilliantly apparent within the first 48 hours of our deployment. My lead forensic accountant, a former federal investigator named David, knocked on my open door late Monday afternoon. He did not look panicked, but the grim, tight set of his jaw told me everything I needed to know about the situation. He walked across the room and placed a thick stack of printed ledgers directly on top of the initial contract my father had signed just days before. The numbers, meticulously highlighted in bright yellow ink, told a story of profound systematic greed that even I had not fully anticipated. There were no shadowy overseas hackers bypassing firewalls, and there were no sophisticated criminal syndicates draining my parents' corporate accounts in the dead of night. Instead, my team found a highly coordinated, meticulously constructed labyrinth of falsified vendor invoices. The company had been bleeding cash for over 3 years, paying exorbitant monthly fees to a network of phantom consulting firms and dummy supply chains. These fake entities existed only on paper registered to anonymous post office boxes scattered across Delaware and Nevada, providing absolutely no services or goods in return for the massive payouts. David pointed out that every single one of these fraudulent payments had been manually approved, requiring top-level executive authorization to clear the banking thresholds. They bypassed the standard procurement protocols, entirely slipping through the cracks of a negligent oversight process. And the sole person holding the necessary administrative clearance to push those specific payments through the secure system was the company's vice president of finance. That title belonged to exactly one person, my sister Felicity. I dismissed David, thanking him for his thoroughness and discretion, and spent the next hour completely alone in my office, tracing the digital paper trail myself. The sheer audacity of her theft was breathtaking to witness. Felicity had been systematically siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars from her own parents, masking her blatant embezzlement behind the chaotic, outdated accounting software my father stubbornly refused to upgrade to modern standards. It was an incredibly sloppy job, the kind of amateur fraud that only works when the perpetrator knows absolutely no one is checking their work or questioning their authority. She was entirely protected by the impenetrable shield of my parents' blind, unwavering favoritism. They trusted her implicitly, handing her the keys to their financial kingdom, simply because she was the golden child who could do no wrong in their eyes. She had used that unconditional trust to fund her lavish lifestyle, buying designer clothes, booking luxury vacations, and projecting the image of a wealthy, successful heiress for her clueless fiancé, Trent. I felt a cold wave of pure satisfaction wash over me as I scrolled through the damning evidence. The disaster actively destroying my parents' legacy was a monster of their own creation. I was just pouring myself a fresh cup of black coffee from the carafe on my credenza when a sudden commotion erupted in the outer reception area. I could hear the sharp, aggressive clicking of designer heels marching forcefully across the hardwood floor, followed immediately by my executive assistant's firm voice, asking the visitor to stop and wait to be formally announced. The heavy oak door to my office flew open, hitting the rubber wall stop with a loud, echoing thud that rattled the picture frames. Felicity stormed into the room, her face flushed red with unearned indignation. She was wearing a pristine white silk blouse and carrying a crocodile skin handbag that cost more than my first car, looking completely out of place in a serious corporate environment where actual work took place. She slammed her manicured hands down hard on the back of the leather guest chair, her massive diamond engagement ring catching the afternoon light. She glared at me, her chest heaving as she prepared to unleash the same tired bullying tactics she had used since we were children fighting in the backyard. She loudly demanded to know what exactly my cyber team thought they were doing, claiming that my employees were locking her out of her own financial systems and freezing her administrative credentials without any prior warning or justification. She yelled that I was severely overstepping my bounds and intentionally disrupting the daily operations of their business just to feed my own massive ego and punish her for being the favorite daughter. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, relishing the bitter, dark roast sliding down my throat. I did not offer her a seat. I did not ask my assistant to call security, though she was hovering nervously in the doorway, waiting for my instruction to remove the hostile intruder. I simply waved my hand, signaling for my assistant to leave us alone and close the heavy door. When the latch clicked shut, the silence in the room amplified Felicity's heavy, angry breathing. I looked at her, completely unbothered by her theatrical display of outrage. When I refused to rise to her bait or offer any defense, Felicity's voice climbed an octave higher, slipping into a frantic panic masked as righteous fury. She accused me of dragging out the investigation on purpose to drain our parents' bank accounts with my ridiculous overpriced retainer fee. She pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, warning me that she was going to call Howard and Catherine the second she left my building. She threatened to tell them that I was deliberately sabotaging the audit, ruining the company out of petty, deep-seated jealousy over her upcoming wedding and her perfect, flawless life. She insisted that they would fire me immediately and hire a real firm one that she would personally oversee and control to ensure the job was done correctly. I remained perfectly still, resting my coffee mug gently on a sleek leather coaster. The desperate, frantic energy rolling off her was palpable, filling every corner of the room with the stench of her mounting panic. She was used to me shrinking back, apologizing, or frantically trying to defend myself against her baseless, cruel accusations. She fully expected a fight, a tearful, emotional argument that she could easily manipulate to her advantage, twisting my words to play the wounded victim later when she reported back to our parents. Instead, I gave her nothing but cold, clinical observation. "You are bleeding money, Felicity," I said softly, leaning forward just slightly over the expanse of my desk. The words hung in the quiet air, stripping away all of her bluster and false bravado in an instant. I kept my eyes locked directly onto hers, watching the sudden, undeniable flicker of genuine fear cross her expression. "And my team is going to find out exactly which artery you cut." The color drained from her cheeks in a rapid, terrifying rush, leaving her skin a pale, sickly white. Her mouth opened slightly, but the vicious insults she had prepared died silently in her throat. She looked down at the stack of highlighted ledgers, sitting openly on my desk, her eyes widening as she finally recognized the specific formatting of her own departmental reports. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow to the stomach. She was no longer standing in our childhood home, shouting at a sister who was forced by our parents to absorb her abuse. She was standing in the headquarters of a multi-million-dollar crisis management firm, facing an executive who held undeniable empirical proof of her extensive financial crimes. She quickly turned on her high heel and practically ran out the heavy oak door, her composure completely shattered, leaving me entirely alone to finish my coffee in absolute peace. The next morning, my team continued working through the financial architecture of my parents' company. By noon, David had mapped the false vendors, the approval chains, and the private accounts receiving the money. Every trail ended at Felicity's credentials. We still needed one final layer of proof, however, evidence showing that she understood the investigation, knew she was exposed, and was willing to interfere with it. Financial records could establish theft. Intentional sabotage would establish consciousness of guilt. I instructed our cybersecurity director, Elena Park, to tighten every access protocol connected to the case. She isolated the copied company data inside a closed forensic environment, activated enhanced logging, and placed several monitored workstations outside the secure review room. Nothing on those terminals could reach our production servers. Any suspicious file would be redirected automatically into a sandbox, where it could execute without damaging a single real system. The workstations looked ordinary, but every keystroke, device connection, and network request would be preserved. I did not tell my family about those precautions. Felicity returned to Apex shortly after 4 o'clock the following afternoon. Sarah called my office and said my sister was in the lobby, carrying 2 document boxes, and insisting that Howard had authorized her to deliver supplemental finance records. She was wearing a cream coat over the same white silk blouse she had worn during our confrontation. Her voice sounded controlled, almost pleasant, but Sarah noticed that she kept glancing toward the security gates. I told Sarah to issue Felicity a temporary visitor badge and send her to conference room 3. Then I called Elena. "Do not stop her unless she approaches a restricted employee or attempts to leave with company property," I said. "Let her believe she has room to make a choice." Elena understood immediately. We were not manufacturing a trap. We were allowing Felicity to reveal what she had already decided to do. When Felicity entered the conference room, I was waiting with David and one junior analyst named Noah. I kept the meeting deliberately routine. She opened the boxes and produced several folders of vendor statements, most of them duplicates of records already stored on the company servers. She claimed our investigators had overlooked them. David asked simple questions about authorization dates. Felicity answered too quickly, then corrected herself twice. Her eyes kept drifting past Noah toward the open workspace outside the glass wall. After 20 minutes, I stood and said I had another client call. David gathered the folders and followed me out, leaving Noah to scan the remaining pages. That arrangement was intentional. Noah knew the protocol. He excused himself 5 minutes later, saying the scanner had jammed and he needed assistance from technical support. Before leaving, he locked the conference room door open and left his monitored terminal visible at the nearest workstation. From the security suite, one floor above, I watched the live camera feeds with Elena. For nearly a minute, Felicity remained seated. She stared at the papers in front of her, tapping one manicured finger against the table. Then she stood. She stepped into the hallway and looked in both directions. The visitor badge on her coat allowed her into the general office area, but not the forensic room. She tested the secure door anyway. A red light flashed, denying access. Her mouth tightened. She moved toward Noah's workstation. The camera above the desk captured every detail. Felicity placed her crocodile handbag beside the keyboard, opened it, and removed a small silver flash drive. She hesitated only once. Then she inserted it into the terminal. A silent notification appeared on Elena's monitoring screen. "External device detected," she said quietly. The workstation appeared to respond normally. In reality, Elena's system copied the flash drive, recorded its digital signature, and redirected every process into the sandbox. A program attempted to launch automatically. It searched for administrator credentials, tried to disable endpoint protection, and began creating encrypted outbound packets designed to resemble a data transfer to an unknown server. Felicity watched the progress bar with desperate concentration. She did not know that the files moving across the screen were harmless replicas. She believed she was infecting Apex. The malware's purpose became clear within seconds. It was designed to copy selected client directories, create evidence of an unauthorized breach, and erase portions of the forensic audit. If successful, Felicity could accuse my firm of losing confidential data. Challenge the integrity of our findings and pressure Howard to terminate the contract before we completed the report. "She wants to destroy the chain of custody," Elena said. "No," I replied. "She wants to destroy my credibility. The audit is only the weapon she is trying to remove." On the camera feed, Felicity leaned closer to the monitor. The false progress bar reached 100%. A message appeared: "Transfer complete." It was generated by our sandbox, not by her malware, but she did not know that. Relief softened her face. She removed the flash drive, wiped it quickly against the lining of her handbag, and looked around again. Then she noticed the small black dome of the ceiling camera. For one dangerous second, she stared directly into it. I wondered whether she understood. But arrogance won. She gave the camera a dismissive glance, apparently assuming it was ordinary building security, with no audio and limited retention. She returned to the conference room, rearranged the documents, and sat down just before Noah came back. I remained in the security suite while Noah thanked her for the supplemental records and escorted her toward the elevators. Felicity walked with renewed confidence. She even stopped at Sarah's desk and said loudly enough for nearby employees to hear that she hoped Apex would finally conduct a competent and ethical investigation. Sarah wished her a pleasant evening without reacting. The elevator doors closed behind her. Elena immediately sealed the digital evidence. She created forensic images of the flash drive, exported the malware activity logs, preserved the authentication records, and placed the security footage into a legally controlled archive. David documented the time, device, identifier, workstation, witnesses, and every step of collection. Nothing would be altered. Nothing would be vulnerable to claims that we had fabricated it later. Within an hour, Elena traced the malware purchase to an online broker, paid through one of Felicity's personal credit cards. The order had been placed the night after she stormed out of my office. The accompanying instructions specifically requested a tool capable of simulating a corporate data breach and corrupting accounting files. That detail removed the last possible excuse. I could have called the police that evening. I could have confronted Felicity before she reached the parking garage. Instead, I authorized my legal team to prepare a notice of contractual breach and instructed everyone involved to remain silent. Felicity believed she had succeeded. That confidence mattered. It would make her bolder, and bold people often carried their lies into rooms filled with witnesses. By Thursday afternoon, David had completed the financial timeline, Elena had authenticated the sabotage evidence, and my attorneys had confirmed that Felicity's conduct allowed Apex to terminate representation while retaining the non-refundable $500,000 fee. We now possessed proof of theft, attempted cyber-sabotage, and deliberate obstruction. Before leaving for the night, I replayed the footage. Felicity's expression at the false completion message was not fear or confusion. It was satisfaction. She had walked into my company, targeted an employee's terminal, and tried to manufacture a disaster that could cost hundreds of innocent people their careers. This was no impulsive family tantrum. It was calculated criminal conduct committed because she believed our parents would protect her and blame me. They had trained her well. My parents still believed they could control the story. The call came on Thursday afternoon. My private line rang, and my mother's voice flowed through the speaker, dripping with a sickeningly sweet tone that immediately set my teeth on edge. She did not mention the audit, the missing money, or Felicity's sudden departure from my office. Instead, she sounded like a woman simply longing to reconnect with her estranged daughter. She suggested that we had let business complicate our reunion and invited me to a private dinner at their country club on Friday evening. She claimed they wanted to put the past behind us, lay all our cards on the table, and finally heal our fractured family dynamic. I knew it was a trap. They were bleeding out, and this was their desperate attempt to apply a tourniquet. But I agreed to attend. I needed to see exactly what kind of leverage they thought they could manufacture against me. Friday evening arrived with a crisp, biting chill in the air. I wore a tailored charcoal suit that projected effortless authority and drove myself to the Oakmont Country Club. It was a sprawling historic estate surrounded by manicured golf courses, a place designed entirely to keep the wealthy insulated from the real world. Growing up, my parents had treated a membership here as the ultimate validation of their social worth. I handed my keys to the valet and walked through the heavy brass doors, my heels clicking softly against the marble floors of the grand lobby. A hostess in a pristine uniform led me through the dining room, past the tables of quietly murmuring elites, toward the private dining alcoves in the back. When the hostess opened the door to the private room, the illusion of a peaceful family reconciliation shattered instantly. It was an ambush orchestrated with the kind of clumsy arrogance only my parents could muster. Howard and Catherine sat on one side of the long mahogany table. Felicity sat across from them, but she was not alone. Sitting right beside my sister, looking incredibly uncomfortable, but trying to maintain a polite smile, was a man I immediately recognized. His name was Trent Sterling. He was a prominent venture capitalist whose family held massive influence in the Boston financial sector. The Sterling family was legendary, not just for their wealth, but for their absolutely ruthless ethical standards. They refused to do business with anyone who carried even a hint of scandal or impropriety. Felicity had landed the ultimate prize in the socialite world, and it was suddenly crystal clear why she had stolen so much money to maintain her flawless facade. My parents had brought Trent to this dinner to serve as a weapon. They fully intended to use his presence and his family's formidable reputation to intimidate me into submission. They assumed that because I ran a corporate firm, I would be terrified of offending a powerful venture capitalist. They thought I would cower back down from the audit and sweep Felicity's crimes under the rug just to avoid a messy public scene in front of Boston royalty. I stepped into the room, my expression perfectly neutral. Howard stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a tight, forced smile. He gestured for me to take the empty seat at the head of the table directly facing Trent and Felicity. "Kira," he said, projecting his voice as if addressing a boardroom rather than his own daughter. "I am so glad you decided to join us. I believe you know your sister, and this is her fiancé, Trent. Trent, this is our estranged daughter, Kira. She runs a small consulting firm downtown." I did not correct his deliberate minimization of my company. I simply extended my hand to Trent. He stood and shook it, his grip firm but hesitant. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Kira," he said politely. "Felicity has told me so much about you." "I doubt that very much," I replied smoothly, taking my seat. "I am sure whatever she has shared has been highly edited." Felicity glared at me, her posture stiff, but she forced a delicate, trembling smile for Trent's benefit. "We just want to put the past behind us, Kira," she murmured, playing the role of the wounded, forgiving sister to absolute perfection. The waiter arrived, pouring expensive red wine and taking our dinner orders. As soon as the heavy wooden door clicked shut behind the staff, the pleasantries evaporated. Catherine leaned forward, resting her forearms on the table, and launched the first attack. She looked at Trent with a heavy, dramatic sigh, placing a comforting hand over her heart. Trent, we wanted you here tonight, because you are going to be part of this family soon, Catherine began, her voice quivering with manufactured sadness. And you need to understand the struggles we have faced with Kira. She has always been the unstable one in our family. We gave her every opportunity, but she chose to run away and harbor these terrible, bitter grudges against us. Trent looked slightly alarmed by the sudden shift in tone, glancing between my mother and me. I simply took a sip of my sparkling water, watching the performance unfold. Howard picked up the narrative seamlessly. We hired Kira's firm earlier this week to handle a minor internal data issue at the supply company, he explained, waving his hand as if the massive financial hemorrhage was nothing more than a spilled cup of coffee. We thought it would be a wonderful way to throw some business her way and rebuild our relationship. But unfortunately, Kira is letting her personal resentments cloud her professional judgment. She is mismanaging the entire crisis. Felicity chimed in, leaning closer to Trent and resting her hand on his arm. She is having her team dig through unrelated departments, locking me out of my own financial servers and causing massive disruptions to our daily operations. It is completely unprofessional. She is just trying to punish us because she is jealous of my success. The echo chamber was working in perfect, sickening harmony. They were building a wall of gaslighting systematically, painting me as a vindictive, incompetent, and deeply unstable woman who was abusing her position to destroy her innocent family. Trent was shifting uncomfortably in his seat. He was a smart man, but he was currently engaged to the Golden Child, and he had no reason to doubt the unified front presented by two respected business owners and the woman he loved. He looked at me, his brow furrowed with concern and a growing sense of disapproval. Kira, Trent started, his voice cautious but carrying the weight of his venture capital authority. If what they are saying is true, using a corporate audit to settle family scores is a very serious ethical violation. My firm deals with corporate disputes often, and this kind of behavior can permanently ruin a consultant's reputation in this city. My parents exchanged a swift, triumphant glance across the wide mahogany table. Their elaborate, malicious trap had finally snapped shut, exactly as they had planned. They had brought in a heavy hitter, someone they believed I could not afford to alienate, and they had successfully poisoned his perception of me. They were using his strict ethical standards as a heavy, blunt instrument to batter me into total, unquestioning compliance. They felt completely, absolutely victorious in their cruel, manipulative game. Felicity sensed the immediate shift in Trent's demeanor and instantly capitalized on the momentum my parents had built. She reached out and placed her perfectly manicured hand gently over Trent's, her fingers trembling in a flawless, calculated display of deep emotional distress. She took a slow, shaky breath, her eyes welling up with thick, convincing tears as she looked around the mahogany table. She told Trent that the situation was actually far worse than simple corporate mismanagement or petty sibling rivalry. She lowered her voice to a dramatic, breathless whisper, ensuring every single syllable carried the maximum possible weight in the quiet, insulated privacy of the dining room. She stated with absolute, unwavering conviction that just hours ago, she had personally caught my cybersecurity firm deliberately leaking their highly classified financial data. She spun an elaborate, entirely fabricated tale about discovering unauthorized, encrypted data transfers originating directly from my private servers. She claimed I was actively stealing their proprietary client lists and sensitive vendor contracts, intending to sell them to their most aggressive corporate competitors in a ruthless bid to destroy the family legacy once and for all. Trent looked physically repulsed by the sheer magnitude of this accusation. In the elite venture capital circles, where he operated corporate espionage and deliberate data theft, were cardinal sins. They were unforgivable offenses that instantly ended careers and resulted in severe federal prosecutions. Felicity watched his reaction closely, feeding off his growing disgust. She turned her attention directly to our father, her voice rising into a crescendo of manufactured panic and righteous indignation. She demanded that Howard terminate my firm's contract immediately, slamming her palm lightly against the table for emphasis. She insisted that keeping Apex Solutions on the payroll for even one more second was a massive, unacceptable liability that the company simply could not afford to risk. Then she turned her gaze toward me. The tears in her eyes vanished for a split second, replaced by a flash of pure, unadulterated malice before the mask of the wounded victim slipped right back into place. She stated that if I did not walk away quietly, she would personally ask Trent to unleash his family's formidable legal team on my company. She promised to bury me under an insurmountable mountain of litigation, drag my professional name through the mud in every major financial publication in the country, and sue Apex Solutions into absolute permanent bankruptcy. She was practically vibrating with the thrill of her own performance, utterly convinced that she had finally backed me into a corner from which I could never possibly escape. Howard leaned back in his heavy leather chair, steepling his fingers under his chin as he absorbed his golden child's performance. He did not ask for proof of her wild accusations. He did not question the logistics of how a vice president of finance could possibly catch a premier cybersecurity firm committing data theft. He simply accepted her lies as absolute gospel because doing so perfectly aligned with his desperate need to regain control over me. He looked at me with an expression of profound theatrical disappointment, shaking his head slowly, as if mourning the loss of a daughter he had never actually cared about in the first place. He let out a heavy, dramatic sigh that filled the quiet room. "We gave you a chance to prove yourself, Kira," he said, his voice dripping with condescending sorrow. "We set aside years of your stubborn rebellion and brought you into our inner circle because we wanted to believe you had changed. We wanted to give you the opportunity to do something meaningful for this family, but you simply could not let go of your petty, childish jealousy of your sister. You let your bitter resentments completely ruin your professional judgment." Catherine reached over and patted Howard's arm, playing the role of the devastated, long-suffering mother to absolute perfection. She dabbed at the corner of her dry eye with a cloth napkin, refusing to look directly at me. "It breaks my heart to see you behave this way, Kira," she murmured softly. "We just wanted to be a family again, but you are leaving us with absolutely no other choice." Howard nodded sternly in agreement, shifting his posture to project ultimate authority. He planted both hands firmly on the table and delivered his final ultimatum. His voice was cold, sharp, and entirely devoid of mercy. "You will issue a full refund of the $500,000 retainer fee by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning," he commanded. "You will immediately withdraw your entire team from our building, and you will sign a comprehensive ironclad non-disclosure agreement, preventing you from ever speaking about our company or our family to anyone. If you refuse to comply with these terms, we will follow through on Felicity's promise. We will use Trent's legal resources to utterly destroy you. We will make sure you never work in corporate crisis management in this city or any other city ever again. We will ruin you, Kira." The echo chamber had reached its absolute peak. They had built a towering, impenetrable fortress of lies, gaslighting, and vicious threats, completely surrounding me on all sides. They sat back in their chairs, a unified front of moral superiority, waiting for me to crack. They expected me to panic, to cry, to frantically beg for their forgiveness, or to desperately try and defend myself against their baseless accusations. They wanted to see me break down in front of Trent Sterling, proving once and for all that I was the unstable, hysterical mess they had always claimed I was. Trent turned his head and looked at me across the pristine white tablecloth. His handsome face was contorted with profound, unmistakable disgust. He viewed me not as a successful chief executive officer, but as a treacherous, unhinged woman who had tried to sabotage her own flesh and blood out of pure malicious spite. His silence was a heavy, crushing judgment, validating every single lie my family had just poured into his ears. He shifted slightly in his chair, putting an extra inch of distance between himself and me, silently communicating that he found my very presence entirely repulsive. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice, nor did I rush to offer a frantic, breathless defense of my character. I sat perfectly still in the plush dining chair, letting their arrogant, misguided certainty settle over the room like a thick, heavy blanket. The sheer predictability of their behavior was almost boring. I reached for my crystal water glass, the ice clinking softly against the sides, and took a slow, deliberate sip. I swallowed, savoring the cool, refreshing feeling against my throat. I placed the glass back onto the table, ensuring it sat perfectly flush against the woven placemat. I reached for the linen napkin resting on my lap, lifted it gracefully, and slowly, meticulously wiped the corners of my mouth. Every single movement I made was measured, calm, and utterly unbothered by the vicious 4-on-1 attack they had just orchestrated. I let the silence stretch out, watching the smug satisfaction on Felicity's face slowly begin to curdle into a faint, uneasy confusion as she realized I was not reacting the way she had anticipated. The heavy tension in the air became almost suffocating as they waited for my response. I took one final steady breath to center myself completely before moving forward. Howard's brow furrowed, his authoritative posture stiffening slightly as my absolute silence dragged on. I calmly folded the linen napkin and placed it neatly beside my plate. Then, maintaining steady, unbroken eye contact with the man sitting directly across from me, I slowly reached my hand down into the depths of my designer leather bag. I grasped the sleek tablet in my bag, feeling the weight of undeniable truth in my palm. The silence in the dining room was thick. Howard and Catherine exchanged a smug glance, their eyes gleaming with the certainty that they had broken my spirit. They expected me to pull out a checkbook to refund their retainer fee or sign away my right to speak. Felicity sat up taller in her plush chair, radiating the triumphant energy of a spoiled child who had successfully bullied her sibling into submission. She tilted her chin upward, waiting for my inevitable surrender. I slowly withdrew my hand, bringing the matte black iPad into the warm light of the crystal chandelier. The sudden appearance of the device caused a ripple of confusion across my parents' faces. Howard frowned deeply as he tried to calculate what kind of desperate defense I could possibly be mounting. I bypassed my toxic family, entirely focusing my undivided attention squarely on the man sitting quietly at the table. Trent Sterling was the heavy artillery they had brought in to destroy me, and I was about to use his strict moral compass to completely obliterate their fragile illusion. I placed the tablet flat onto the polished mahogany surface and pushed it smoothly across the table. It glided silently over the wood, coming to a deliberate stop directly in front of Trent. The screen was dark, reflecting the flickering glow of the tabletop candles. I leaned back into my chair, resting my hands comfortably in my lap, and let my gaze lock onto his confused eyes. "Before you decide to unleash your legal team to destroy my professional reputation, Trent," I said, my voice cutting through the silence, "I highly suggest you take a close look at exactly who you are marrying." Trent stared at me for a long, tense moment. He was a seasoned venture capitalist, a man who built his entire career on analyzing data and mitigating catastrophic risks. He was trained to demand verifiable facts. The unwavering certainty in my voice triggered his professional instincts, overriding the protective loyalty he felt toward his fiancée. He looked down at the dark screen resting inches from his hands. Felicity let out a sharp, nervous laugh, reaching out quickly to try and push the tablet away from him. "Trent, do not even bother looking at that." She stammered, her voice suddenly an octave higher than it had been moments before. "She is trying to cause trouble because she is incredibly jealous of us." Trent gently but firmly caught Felicity's wrist, stopping her frantic movement. He kept his eyes fixed on the tablet. "I just want to see what she has to show me, Felicity," he murmured, his voice tight with sudden tension. He reached out with his index finger and tapped the center of the dark glass. The screen instantly flared to life, illuminating his handsome face with a cool blue glow. He tapped the play button resting in the center of the video file, and the overwhelming silence of the room was replaced by the ambient sounds of a corporate office after hours. The video playing on the screen was captured by one of the hidden security cameras positioned directly above the junior employee workstations at Apex Solutions. The resolution was crystal clear, leaving no room for ambiguity or misinterpretation. The bright timestamp in the bottom right corner of the footage clearly displayed Wednesday's date and the exact time of the late afternoon. The camera angle provided a perfect, unobstructed view of the quiet, empty hallway leading into the secure data sector. Trent watched intently as the heavy glass door in the footage slowly pushed open. A figure stepped cautiously into the frame, glancing nervously over her shoulder to ensure the hallway was completely empty. It was Felicity. She was wearing the same pristine white silk blouse and carrying the identical crocodile skin handbag she had brought to Apex when she delivered the supplemental records on Wednesday afternoon. Trent leaned closer to the screen, his eyes narrowing in sudden disbelief. On the video, Felicity hurried over to a vacant terminal belonging to one of my junior analysts. She dropped her expensive bag onto the desk, her movements frantic and deeply uncoordinated. She dug her hand into her purse and pulled out a small metallic silver flash drive. The camera captured the undeniable tremble in her fingers as she leaned down toward the computer tower. She jammed the malicious flash drive directly into the open USB port. The glow of the computer monitor illuminated her face, perfectly capturing the heavy sweat gathering on her forehead and the wide, terrified panic in her eyes as she typed on the keyboard. She was trying to upload a catastrophic malware virus directly onto my highly secure corporate servers, intending to trigger a massive data breach that she could conveniently blame on my firm to ruin my reputation. The silence inside the private dining alcove became absolutely deafening as the undeniable reality of the footage washed over the table. The only sound in the room was the faint rhythmic breathing of the people watching a carefully constructed lie completely fall apart. Trent stared at the glowing screen, his face hardening into an expression of pure shock. The man sitting beside my sister was watching the woman he loved commit a serious corporate felony in high-definition video. He watched as the silent security alarm flashed red on the computer monitor in the video, indicating that my closed-loop sandbox environment had instantly quarantined her sloppy malware attempt before it could do any actual damage. He watched Felicity panic, yank the flash drive out of the computer, and practically run out of the office in sheer terror. When the video finally ended, the screen faded back to black, plunging the dining room back into thick, heavy shadows. Trent did not say a single word. He did not look up from the dark screen. He simply sat there, his broad shoulders rigidly tense as the horrifying truth of his fiancée's malicious criminal behavior settled heavily into his bones. The flawless, innocent victim she had pretended to be just minutes ago vanished completely, replaced by the reality of a desperate, calculating saboteur who was willing to destroy a company to cover her own tracks. Felicity turned ghost white. The vibrant flush completely drained from her cheeks in a rapid, terrifying rush, leaving her skin looking like dull gray ash. Her mouth opened and closed silently, like a suffocating fish, as she struggled to pull air into her tightening lungs. The poise, the arrogance, and the smug superiority she had wielded like a weapon all evening totally evaporated. "Trent," she gasped, her voice cracking into a high, desperate squeak. "Trent, you cannot possibly believe that is real. It is a fake. She is a computer expert, Trent. She made that video using artificial intelligence. It is a deep fake. She manipulated the footage to frame me because she wants to ruin my life." Her frantic, breathless lies only seemed to deepen the absolute disgust radiating from Trent. He slowly pulled his hand away from hers, a deliberate physical rejection that caused Felicity to let out a sharp, wounded sob. Howard suddenly realized that his entire strategy was actively collapsing right in front of his eyes. The powerful venture capitalist he had brought in to intimidate me was instead witnessing the total humiliating destruction of his golden child. Howard's face contorted with sudden aggressive panic. He lunged awkwardly across the wide mahogany table, his arms outstretched as he desperately tried to snatch the iPad away from Trent's side of the table. "Give me that device right now!" Kira Howard yelled, his voice echoing loudly off the wood-paneled walls of the private room. "This is an absolutely cruel, sickening trick you are playing on your own family. I will not sit here and allow you to show these fabricated, malicious lies to Trent. You are trying to destroy your sister's future because you are a bitter, vindictive failure." Howard's hand slapped down hard on the table, his fingers grasping wildly for the smooth edge of the tablet, knocking over a crystal water glass in his clumsy, desperate haste. Water spilled across the pristine white linen, soaking into the fabric as chaos consumed the room. I remained perfectly calm, sitting back in my chair with absolute unwavering stillness. I watched the violent, hysterical meltdown of the people who had tried to ruin me, feeling nothing but cold, quiet satisfaction as their carefully curated world began to burn. Howard stood there panting heavily, his hand hovering over the spilled water spreading rapidly across the pristine white linen tablecloth. He realized he could not simply snatch the device and smash it to pieces without looking completely unhinged in front of the one powerful man he desperately needed to impress. Trent slowly reached out, his movements precise and deliberate, and slid the tablet back across the table toward me. He did not say a single word to my father. He simply looked at Felicity, his expression transitioning from profound shock into a hard, impenetrable mask of absolute judgment. Felicity was hyperventilating now, her manicured hands clutching the edges of the heavy table as she desperately tried to formulate another plausible lie to save her crumbling facade. Catherine rushed to her side, wrapping a protective arm around her golden child's trembling shoulders, murmuring soothing words that sounded entirely hollow and pathetic in the heavy, tense atmosphere of the private dining room. Howard straightened his suit jacket, trying in vain to salvage whatever shred of authoritative dignity he had left. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his face still flushed dark red with unbridled fury. He declared loudly that I was a manipulative monster for staging such a ridiculous, elaborate stunt. He insisted that my fraudulent video proved exactly why my firm deserved to be fired immediately and sued into permanent oblivion. I ignored his empty, pathetic threats completely. I picked up the tablet, calmly wiped a stray drop of water from the dark screen, and slipped it safely back into my designer bag. The security video was only the opening act of this necessary performance. It was the crucial precursor required to strip away their arrogant presumption that I was the villain of this story. Now it was finally time to deliver the ultimate crushing blow. I reached down into my bag a second time and pulled out the thick, professionally bound stack of printed financial ledgers my lead forensic accountant had finalized just hours ago. The thick pages were heavily annotated, marked meticulously with bright yellow highlighter, and officially sealed with the corporate crest of Apex Solutions. I held the heavy stack of damning documents in my hands for a brief moment, feeling the undeniable absolute weight of empirical truth. Then I tossed the thick file onto the center of the mahogany table. It landed with a loud, resounding thud that echoed sharply off the wood-paneled walls, instantly silencing my father's frantic yelling and cutting off Felicity's dramatic, breathless sobs. The sudden quiet in the room was absolute and terrifying. Everyone stared at the stack of papers as if it were a live, ticking grenade waiting to detonate and destroy their lives. I looked directly at my father, leaning forward slightly to ensure my voice carried the full, unyielding weight of my corporate authority. I told him that my elite team had spent the last 3 days tearing methodically through his company's severely outdated financial servers. I explained that we had traced every single line of code, every encrypted email, and every single digital transaction that had occurred within his logistics firm over the past 36 months. Howard frowned deeply, his eyes darting nervously to the thick file resting on the table. I stated with absolute unwavering certainty that the massive financial leak actively destroying his business was not the result of a sophisticated external cyber attack. There were no foreign hackers bypassing their weak firewalls, and there was absolutely no mysterious corporate espionage taking place. The disastrous financial hemorrhage that had brought his company to the absolute brink of federal investigation was an inside job, orchestrated with breathtaking, undeniable arrogance and astonishing stupidity. Catherine gasped loudly, her hand tightening reflexively around Felicity's shoulder. She demanded to know what I was talking about, insisting with manufactured outrage that no one in their loyal corporate family would ever do such a terrible, destructive thing. I did not even look at my mother. I kept my gaze locked firmly on my father, watching the slow, creeping dread begin to pool in the dark corners of his eyes. I instructed him to open the file and look closely at the highlighted sections. I told him that my forensic accountants had uncovered a vast, intricate network of completely falsified vendor invoices. The company had been paying exorbitant monthly consulting fees and massive supply chain retainers to dummy corporations registered to empty post office boxes in Delaware and Nevada. Those companies did not actually exist anywhere except on paper. They provided absolutely no services, delivered no goods, and performed no consulting work. They were merely empty, fraudulent buckets designed specifically to catch the millions of dollars being quietly siphoned out of his core operating accounts right under his nose. Howard's hands shook violently as he reached out and pulled the thick file toward him. He flipped open the heavy cover and stared down at the highlighted spreadsheets. I watched his eyes scan the rows of damning numbers, his years of business acumen finally cutting through his deep parental delusion. He saw the repeated dates, the inflated amounts, and the familiar routing numbers. I explained that every single one of those fraudulent payments had deliberately bypassed standard procurement protocols. They required top-level executive authorization to clear the internal banking thresholds without triggering automated security alarms. I kept my voice perfectly level, letting the cold, hard facts fill the room with devastating clarity. The sole person holding the necessary administrative clearance to manually approve and push those specific phantom payments through the secure system was the Vice President of Finance. Trent turned his head very slowly, his sharp gaze landing heavily on the woman sitting beside him. Felicity was the Vice President of Finance. It was a nepotism title my parents had happily handed her to make her look important, but it came with real dangerous administrative power. Howard let out a low, strangled sound as he looked up from the papers. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly old and entirely hollow. Catherine let go of Felicity's shoulder, taking a slow, horrified step backward as the terrible truth finally penetrated her thick wall of denial. I stated the exact dollar amount that was currently missing from their corporate ledgers, down to the very last cent. The total was a staggering sum, perfectly matching the financial hole that had put their beloved business directly into the crosshairs of the Securities and Exchange Commission. I turned my full attention to Felicity, who was now trembling uncontrollably, her eyes wide with sheer unadulterated panic. I told the room that my sister had stolen that exact amount of money from her own parents to fund her lavish, extravagant lifestyle. She had embezzled millions to buy designer clothes, book luxury vacations, and project the flawless, untarnished image of a wealthy, successful heiress for her powerful fiancé. The golden child was not a victim of a cyber attack, and she was certainly not a successful business executive. She was a prolific, unrepentant felon who had systematically robbed her own family blind for 3 consecutive years. The devastation in this dining room was absolute and complete. The numbers printed on those white pages were undeniable, officially verified by the top crisis management firm in the city. Trent Sterling sat frozen in his chair, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle feathered in his cheek. I was looking at the woman he intended to marry, realizing her entire persona, wealth, status, and supposed success were all funded by stolen money and corporate fraud. He realized she was perfectly willing to destroy my firm to cover her tracks, cementing her malicious nature in his mind. Trent slowly reached his hand into his tailored suit jacket and withdrew a sleek silver fountain pen. He did not say a single word. He did not look at Felicity. He simply placed the pen down onto the table directly beside the damning financial documents. Then, with deliberate, agonizingly slow movements, he reached his right hand over to his left. He pinched the heavy, expensive gold engagement ring sitting on his finger, twisted it slightly to break the tension, and pulled it completely off. The soft, metallic clink of the gold ring hitting the polished mahogany wood sounded like a gunshot in the silent dining room. Felicity let out a raw, high-pitched wail of pure, unadulterated devastation. She lunged forward, her hands scrambling desperately across the table, trying to grab Trent's arm, trying to force the ring back into his hand. "Trent, no. Please, Trent, you cannot do this!" She sobbed, her voice breaking into a hysterical, ugly cry. "She is twisting everything. I did it for us. I just wanted to be perfect for you. I wanted to fit into your world. You have to listen to me. I love you." Trent pulled his arm away from her frantic, clawing grasp with a sharp, forceful jerk. He stood up from the table, his tall frame looming over the pathetic, crumbling ruin of the woman he had intended to marry. His handsome face, usually so composed and charismatic, was twisted into a mask of profound, unmistakable revulsion. He looked down at Felicity not with anger, but with the cold, absolute detachment of a man looking at a dangerous, highly contagious disease. "You did not do this for me, Felicity," Trent said, his voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register that cut straight through her hysterical sobbing. "You did this because you are a fraud. Your entire existence is a lie built on stolen money and corporate felonies. You were perfectly willing to let your own sister take the fall and face federal prosecution just to protect your fake, pathetic little life." He turned his gaze away from her sobbing form and looked directly at Howard and Catherine, who were both sitting frozen in their chairs, their faces pale and drawn with absolute terror. "And the two of you," Trent continued, his voice dripping with venomous disgust, "you are even worse. You sat here and tried to use my family's reputation to intimidate and threaten an innocent woman, all while knowing your other daughter was robbing you blind. The Sterling family does not associate with thieves, and we absolutely do not do business with people who cover up felonies to save face." Trent turned his attention to me. For the first time all evening, the look of judgment in his eyes was completely gone, replaced by a deep, grudging respect. He gave me a curt, formal nod. "I apologize for doubting you, Kira. I should have known better than to believe anything that came out of their mouths." Without waiting for a response, Trent turned on his heel and walked swiftly toward the heavy oak door. Felicity scrambled out of her chair, her designer heels slipping clumsily on the polished marble floor. She threw herself toward the door, desperately reaching out to grab the back of Trent's suit jacket. "Trent, wait. Please, you cannot just leave me here. I will fix it. I will put the money back. Just give me another chance." Trent did not even slow his stride. He wrenched the door open easily, shaking off her weak, frantic grasp, and stepped out into the quiet, carpeted hallway of the country club. The heavy door slammed shut behind him with a loud, definitive thud, violently severing their relationship forever. Felicity collapsed against the closed door, her knees giving out completely as the absolute crushing reality of her situation finally hit her. The perfect, flawless life she had stolen millions to build was gone. The wealthy, powerful fiancé was gone. The social status she had craved more than oxygen was permanently destroyed. She slid down the smooth wood of the door, landing in an ungraceful, crumpled heap on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. I remained seated at the head of the table, watching the chaotic, miserable scene unfold with total emotional detachment. I felt no pity for my sister's tears. I felt no sympathy for my parents' sudden catastrophic downfall. They had spent 30 years cultivating this exact disaster, watering it with their toxic favoritism and feeding it with their endless enabling lies. Now the harvest had finally arrived. Howard slowly lowered his head into his hands, rubbing his temples as if trying to massage away the massive, insurmountable reality of his impending doom. The company he had built, the legacy he prized above his own flesh and blood, was actively bleeding out. He had no fiancé to bail him out. He had no scapegoat left to blame. He was staring directly down the barrel of a federal investigation, and the only person holding the shield was sitting right across from him. Howard remained paralyzed in his leather chair, the heavy silence of the room broken only by the pathetic, gasping sobs coming from the floor. Felicity was a crumpled mess of ruined silk and smeared makeup, crying hysterically against the heavy oak door where Trent had just exited. Instead of looking at her eldest daughter with horror or demanding an explanation for the millions of dollars stolen from their family legacy, Catherine dropped to her knees. She wrapped her arms protectively around the very person who had just orchestrated their absolute financial destruction. She stroked Felicity's hair, murmuring soft, meaningless words of comfort, treating the prolific embezzler like a wounded toddler who had simply scraped her knee. It was a breathtaking display of pathological denial. Catherine slowly lifted her head from her golden child's shoulder and turned her tear-streaked face toward me. The comforting motherly facade vanished instantly, replaced by a vicious, unyielding glare full of pure hatred. "How could you do this to your sister?" Catherine screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the wood-paneled walls. Her eyes were wide, flashing with an irrational, misplaced fury that completely ignored the damning financial ledgers resting on the table. "You ruined her wedding, Kira. You waited until Trent was sitting right here, and you deliberately destroyed the most important day of her entire life, out of pure malicious spite. You could have just fixed the numbers quietly. You are a financial expert. You could have moved the funds around, balanced the books, and protected our family without causing this horrible, unnecessary disaster. Howard finally lifted his head from his hands, his face pale and drawn, yet his expression hardened into one of familiar, stubborn authority as he aligned himself with his wife's delusional narrative. He looked at the thick stack of forensic accounting documents that explicitly detailed his impending ruin, then looked at me with an expression of profound, misplaced betrayal. "Your mother is right, Kira," he muttered, his voice shaking with a pathetic mixture of fear and lingering arrogance. "We hired Apex Solutions to resolve a corporate crisis, not to launch a personal witch hunt against your own flesh and blood. You were supposed to find a solution, a discreet internal way to manage this situation without exposing our private family matters to an outside investor." Felicity made a mistake, a terrible miscalculation, but she is still family. She was just trying to keep up appearances for the Sterling family to secure a future that would have benefited all of us in the long run. You had absolutely no right to ambush her like this. You have humiliated us in front of one of the most powerful men in the city, and you have permanently severed a relationship that could have saved our logistics firm. You did not save the company tonight, Kira. You completely destroyed it. I sat perfectly still, observing the three of them with a strange, detached fascination. After 30 years of being the designated scapegoat, after a lifetime of carrying the heavy, suffocating burden of their endless expectations and moving the goalposts of their approval, I finally saw them with absolute crystal clarity. They were not powerful figures to be feared or respected. They were weak, pathetic, and utterly crippled by their own toxic illusions. They were literally standing in the ashes of their burning empire, holding the matches their golden child had used to light the fire, and they were furiously screaming at the fire alarm for making too much noise. The sheer magnificent absurdity of their delusion bubbled up in my chest. A soft, genuine chuckle escaped my lips. It started low, a quiet vibration of genuine amusement, before building into a cold, hard laugh that cut through the suffocating tension in the room like a steel blade. The sound was sharp, entirely devoid of warmth, and it instantly silenced my mother's hysterical accusations. Howard flinched, his eyes widening in confusion as my laughter echoed off the walls. I was not supposed to laugh. I was supposed to hang my head in shame, to absorb their misplaced blame, and to frantically try to fix the catastrophic mess Felicity had created. I stopped laughing and leaned forward, resting my forearms on the mahogany table. My voice dropped into a low, quiet register that carried the absolute, unyielding weight of undeniable truth. "You are facing federal indictments, Dad," I stated slowly, enunciating every single syllable to ensure the reality penetrated his thick skull. "You are not facing a simple corporate miscalculation or a minor bookkeeping error. You are staring directly at massive systemic wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and the deliberate falsification of financial documents across state lines. The Securities and Exchange Commission is already preparing to tear your entire logistics firm apart, and the Internal Revenue Service will be right behind them." I pointed a steady, manicured finger at the sobbing woman on the floor. "Your golden child stole your retirement, your company, and your entire professional reputation to buy designer clothes and fund a fake lifestyle. She committed serious, premeditated felonies for 3 consecutive years, completely draining your core operating accounts and leaving you bankrupt. And yet, instead of holding her accountable, you are sitting here mad at the mirror for showing you the reflection." The sheer bluntness of my words finally seemed to pierce the thick layer of denial insulating my parents from the actual consequences of this evening. Catherine let out a short, terrified gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth as she stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. The color rapidly drained from her perfectly manicured face, leaving her looking hollow and aged. For the very first time in my entire life, she did not have a sharp retort or a cruel dismissal ready to fire back at me. She was a woman completely stripped of her social armor, finally realizing that no possible amount of country club connections or polite family smiles could possibly protect her from the devastating legal tsunami that was rapidly approaching their doorstep. Howard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat as the profound weight of my assessment settled over him. He slumped forward, his broad shoulders suddenly curling inward, making him look small and incredibly frail against the backdrop of the opulent dining room. He reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the thick, officially bound financial report closer to his chest, staring down at the highlighted columns of falsified vendor payments with an expression of sheer unadulterated horror. He was a man who had dedicated his entire existence to building a respectable, lucrative corporate empire, sacrificing his relationship with me to ensure his legacy would endure. Now he was being forced to confront the undeniable fact that the daughter he had elevated to the highest pedestal had systematically dismantled that very legacy from the inside out. Felicity continued to sob on the floor, her frantic wails growing louder and more desperate as she realized her parents were no longer rushing to defend her honor. She had spent her entire adult life effortlessly manipulating them easily, spinning every single mistake she ever made into someone else's fault. She had genuinely believed she was invincible, utterly convinced that her status as the beautiful, successful golden child would magically shield her from any real-world accountability. But the cold hard data did not care about her manufactured tears, and the federal investigators certainly would not care about her ruined engagement. I watched them drown in the terrifying reality of their own making, feeling absolutely no sympathy, no guilt, and absolutely no lingering desire to save them. They had dug this grave together, shoveling the dirt with their own two hands, and now they were finally going to lie in it forever. The silence stretched out, broken only by Felicity weeping on the floor. I watched my parents staring at the financial documents, their minds trapped in a crushing reality they could no longer deny. There was no clever public relations angle that could erase the cold numbers printed on those pages. No charming smile could stop a federal indictment. I allowed them to sit in that suffocating despair for a little while longer, letting the absolute finality of their situation sink deeply into their bones. Then I reached into my leather bag for the last time tonight. My fingers brushed past the sleek tablet, finding the thick envelope waiting at the bottom. I pulled it out, the stark white paper contrasting sharply against the dim lighting of the dining room. The envelope was sealed with the official silver crest of Apex Solutions. It was not a family letter. It was a formal legal document drafted by my corporate attorneys just hours before this dinner. I placed it onto the polished mahogany table and slid it precisely toward my father. It came to rest right on top of the financial ledgers, a pristine white flag of surrender he was entirely unprepared to receive. Howard looked down at the envelope, his brow furrowing in confusion. He was still struggling to process the revelation of Felicity's embezzlement, and his brain was clearly misfiring. He did not reach for the envelope. He simply stared at it, as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. "What is this?" Howard rasped, his voice sounding like dry sandpaper. The booming, authoritative tone he had wielded my entire life was completely gone. He sounded frail, terrified, and utterly defeated. I did not soften my expression. I looked at him not as a daughter seeking validation, but as the chief executive officer of the crisis management firm he had hired to save his sinking ship. "That is your official notice of termination," I stated clearly, ensuring every syllable carried the absolute weight of a final verdict. "Apex Solutions is formally withdrawing our representation of your logistics firm effective immediately." My words caused a physical reaction in my father. He jerked backward in his heavy leather chair as if I had struck him across the face. Catherine gasped loudly, her hands flying to her mouth in shock. Felicity even stopped her dramatic sobbing for a brief second, the sheer panic momentarily overriding her performance. "You cannot do that," Howard stammered, his eyes darting frantically between me and the white envelope resting on the table. "We have a signed, binding contract, Kira. You are legally obligated to manage this crisis and handle the federal investigation. You cannot just abandon your clients in the middle of a catastrophic emergency. It violates every standard of corporate practice." "Actually, Howard, you are the one who violated the contract," I explained, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotional inflection. "When your company retained my firm, You signed a comprehensive service agreement. Section 4 of that agreement contains a very specific non-negotiable clause regarding client conduct and intentional sabotage. I pointed a manicured finger toward the thick envelope. My legal team has outlined the entire breach in that letter. Your Vice President of Finance, the Golden Child, currently sitting on the floor, deliberately attempted to introduce malicious malware into my highly secure corporate servers. She was actively trying to trigger a massive data breach within my company to cover up her own financial crimes. That action constitutes a severe, undeniable breach of our professional contract. You cannot hire a crisis management firm to save your business and then actively attempt to destroy that same firm to hide your own guilt. Because of Felicity's malicious actions, our business relationship is permanently severed. We are no longer representing you. We will not be communicating with the federal authorities on your behalf, and we will not be shielding your company from the impending legal fallout. You are completely and entirely on your own. Howard stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently as his mind raced to calculate the devastating implications of my statement. He reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the white envelope, gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned a sickly shade of white. But the retainer, he whispered, his voice cracking under the immense strain. We paid your firm a $500,000 retainer fee just days ago. If you are terminating the contract, you have to return those funds immediately. We need that money to hire another defense firm. We need that capital to survive the upcoming week. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest, and offered him a thin, mirthless smile. You should really read the contracts you sign, Howard, I said softly. Because Felicity initiated a hostile breach of our agreement through intentional sabotage, my firm is legally entitled to retain the entirety of that initial fee as compensatory damages. That $500,000 is non-refundable. We are keeping every single cent of it to cover the extensive forensic accounting work we have already performed and to compensate for the cyber attack. You are not getting a refund, and you have no liquid capital left to hire anyone else. Felicity stole your core operating funds, and now I am keeping your last remaining lifeline because she tried to ruin my business. The absolute gravity of the situation finally crushed the last remaining fragments of Howard's legendary arrogance. He dropped the white envelope onto the table as if it burned his fingers. His chest began to heave with rapid, shallow breaths as full-blown panic consumed him. He realized with terrifying clarity that he was completely trapped. His powerful venture capitalist safety net had literally walked out the door in disgust. His golden child was a prolific felon who had systematically embezzled his life's work. His primary operating accounts were completely empty. The federal investigators were already circling like hungry sharks waiting for blood in the water. And now the only person on the entire planet who possessed the specialized skills, the elite corporate connections, and the sheer operational brilliance required to navigate this apocalyptic nightmare was formally walking away and retaining his last $500,000 as legally authorized compensation. Howard's face contorted into an expression of sheer, unadulterated terror. He pushed himself up from his chair, his knees knocking against the heavy wood of the table, and he actually fell to his knees on the marble floor. It was a pathetic, shocking display of total submission from a man who had spent 30 years demanding that I bow to him. "Kira, please," Howard begged, his voice breaking into a wet, desperate sob. "You cannot do this to us. You cannot just leave us here to die. We will lose everything. The company, the house, our entire reputation, it will all be gone. The federal government will tear us apart piece by piece and put me in prison. You are the only one who can fix this mess. You are the best crisis manager in the country. Please, I am begging you. I am your father. You have to stay and help us. You have to save our family." I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my tailored suit jacket with calm, deliberate movements. I looked down at the man kneeling on the floor, the man who had called me a vindictive failure just 10 minutes ago. I felt absolutely nothing for him. There was no pity, no lingering daughterly affection, and certainly no desire to rescue him from the flames. "You do not have a family, Howard," I said, my voice ringing with cold, absolute finality. "You have an audience, and the show is permanently canceled. Enjoy the federal indictment." I pulled my arm firmly out of my mother's grasp, watching her hand fall limply to her side. The desperation in her eyes was entirely genuine, now completely stripped of the polite country club veneer she had hidden behind for decades. For my entire life, her love had been a transactional currency only dispensed when I made her look good and swiftly withdrawn the second I threatened Felicity's spotlight. Now the bank was empty. The cool night air of the valet stand felt incredibly sharp and clean against my skin, a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the private dining room we had just left. A sleek black town car pulled up to the curb, the tires coming to a quiet stop right beside us. The valet, a young man who had clearly noticed the intense family drama unfolding on the pavement, quickly stepped out and held the rear door open for me. He kept his eyes averted, offering a professional nod as I reached into my bag and handed him a crisp $100 bill. Howard lunged forward, placing his heavy hand against the frame of the open car door, physically blocking my exit. His face was a mask of pure panic, the arrogant corporate patriarch, entirely replaced by a terrified, broken old man who finally understood that his empire was turning to ash. "You cannot just walk away from this, Kira," he demanded, his voice cracking with a pathetic mixture of authority and begging. "We are your parents. You owe us your loyalty. If the federal investigators come into the office tomorrow morning, they will seize everything. The supply chain contracts, the vendor accounts, my entire pension, it will all be frozen." I stared at his hand gripping the dark metal of the car door, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound, overwhelming sense of closure. "10 years ago, you canceled my 23rd birthday because Felicity needed you. You told me I was the strong one. So be strong for her now because I am done." "I do not owe you anything, Howard," I stated quietly, my voice ringing with total finality. "You chose your loyalty years ago when you handed a teenager the keys to your financial kingdom, just because she knew how to smile and play the part of the perfect daughter. You chose your loyalty tonight when you sat in that dining room and threatened to destroy my business just to protect her lies. The federal investigators are not coming tomorrow morning because of me. They are coming because your golden child committed massive systemic wire fraud, and you were too blindly arrogant to notice the millions bleeding out of your own bank accounts." I stepped closer to him, forcing him to meet my gaze. "Move your hand from my car." Howard blinked, visibly taken aback by the absolute coldness in my eyes. He slowly pulled his hand back, stepping away from the vehicle as if he had suddenly been burned. Catherine let out a loud, dramatic sob, burying her face in her hands, as the reality of their impending doom finally crushed her remaining delusions. She did not reach for me again. She simply stood on the curb, weeping for the loss of her social status and her country club memberships, mourning the superficial life she had prioritized over her own flesh and blood. Just as I slid into the luxurious leather seat of the town car, the heavy glass doors of the lobby burst open. Felicity stumbled out onto the pavement, her designer dress wrinkled, and her makeup completely ruined by a torrent of hysterical, panicked tears. She looked around wildly, her eyes darting between our parents and my waiting car. "Trent is gone," she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the quiet country club driveway. "He turned his phone off. He will not answer my calls. You have to fix this, Kira. You have to call him and tell him you made a mistake. Tell him the audit was wrong." The sheer breathtaking audacity of her demand actually made me smile. Even now, standing on the absolute brink of a federal indictment, her only concern was losing her wealthy fiancé and the prestigious lifestyle he provided. She was completely incapable of understanding the massive legal avalanche that was about to bury her. I pulled the heavy car door shut, the solid thud cutting off her frantic screaming instantly. Through the tinted glass window, I watched them standing together under the bright glow of the valet awning. My father looked pale and completely defeated. My mother was sobbing into her hands. My sister was throwing a violent, childish tantrum on the pavement. They looked like exactly what they were, a broken, toxic trio of people who had built a fragile house of cards and were now furiously blaming the wind for blowing it down. "Drive," I told the driver quietly. The car pulled smoothly away from the curb, merging into the quiet evening traffic. I did not look back. The drive back into the city, was the most peaceful experience I had enjoyed in my entire adult life. Watching the bright city lights blur past the window, I felt the heavy, suffocating weight of my childhood finally lifting from my shoulders. I had spent decades trying to earn their respect, tying myself in exhausting knots to prove that my corporate success was just as valid as Felicity's manufactured perfection. I had absorbed their demands, endured their insults, and swallowed their endless casual cruelties. Now the twisted familial contract was permanently severed. I pulled my phone from my bag and dialed my lead forensic accountant, David. He answered on the second ring, the quiet hum of our corporate office audible in the background. "The meeting is concluded," I told him, keeping my voice perfectly level and professional. "They breached the contract through intentional sabotage. We are keeping the retainer. Release the final audit report to the federal regulatory authorities exactly as we planned. Do not hold anything back." There was a brief pause on the line before Marcus replied with a crisp, understanding confirmation. "Consider it done, Kira. The digital files will be transmitted to the Securities and Exchange Commission immediately." I ended the call and leaned my head back against the soft leather seat, letting out a long, slow breath. The machinery of justice was now fully in motion, and there was absolutely nothing my father could do to stop it. Tomorrow morning, their logistics firm would be raided by federal agents. The dummy corporations, the falsified vendor invoices, and the missing millions would all become matters of permanent public record. Felicity would face multiple felony charges for embezzlement and wire fraud, completely destroying any chance she had of securing another wealthy victim or maintaining her precious social standing. Howard and Catherine would lose the company they prized above their own daughter, watching their carefully curated legacy dissolve into a massive, humiliating bankruptcy. They would finally experience the harsh, unforgiving reality of the real world, a world where actions have actual consequences, and golden children are not immune to federal prosecution. The town car pulled to a smooth stop in front of my high-rise apartment building. The doorman smiled warmly as he held the glass door open for me, welcoming me home. I stepped into the bright, quiet lobby, my heels clicking confidently against the polished marble floor. I was no longer the scapegoat, the forgotten sister, or the unappreciated daughter. I was the chief executive officer of the most elite crisis management firm in the city, and I had just flawlessly managed the most important crisis of my entire life. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the penthouse. The doors slid shut, sealing me safely inside my own successful, peaceful world. The revenge was finally complete, and it was undeniably perfectly sweet. Tomorrow would bring chaos for them, but for me it would bring absolute permanent freedom. A full 7 days had passed since I walked out of that suffocating private dining room at the country club. One single ordinary week was all it took for 30 years of carefully manufactured lies to completely unravel. Without Apex Solutions standing between his logistics firm and the cold reality of federal oversight, the dam finally broke. The initial leak started small. A minor financial blog picked up a rumor about severe cash flow irregularities at one of the absolute most prominent supply chain companies. But blood in the water always attracts bigger sharks. By Wednesday morning, the quiet rumors had transformed into a deafening roar across every major financial news network in the country. The truth was out, and it was far uglier than anyone outside that dining room had ever anticipated. I watched the collapse unfold from the pristine sanctuary of my corporate penthouse office, viewing the broadcast on the sleek flat screen mounted to my wall. The breaking news banners scrolling across the bottom of the screen were relentless. They detailed the massive scope of the embezzlement, the dummy vendor accounts, and the millions of dollars systematically siphoned to fund a lavish, fraudulent lifestyle. The reporters did not know her name yet, but they knew the title of the Vice President of Finance, and they knew the money was gone. By Thursday, the federal authorities made their move. The Securities and Exchange Commission, flanked by agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, descended upon the corporate headquarters. I watched the aerial helicopter footage on the news, seeing the swarm of dark federal vehicles surrounding the massive glass and steel building my father had prized above his own family. Agents walked out carrying dozens of heavy cardboard boxes filled with physical ledgers, hard drives, and encrypted servers. The optical illusion of that impenetrable business empire was being dismantled live on national television, boxed up as federal evidence. The financial execution was swift and merciless. By Friday afternoon, a federal judge signed the emergency injunctions. Every single corporate and personal bank account associated with Howard, Catherine, and Felicity was frozen immediately. The venture capitalist safety net was gone, the operating capital was seized, and the personal wealth they had leveraged to intimidate people for decades was entirely inaccessible. They could not pay their mortgage. They could not pay their country club dues. They could not even afford to retain the highly powered criminal defense attorneys they so desperately needed to fight the impending indictments. I sat back in my plush leather chair, turning my gaze away from the television screen and looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office. The city skyline stretched out before me, bright and limitless. The environment inside my firm was a stark contrast to the absolute chaos consuming my parents. Here the air was cool and quiet, humming with the steady, productive energy of a highly successful enterprise. I was not scrambling to cover up felonies or begging investors for a lifeline. I was exactly where I belonged, presiding over an empire built on genuine hard work, undeniable expertise, and absolute integrity. My office door opened with a soft click, and David, my lead forensic accountant, stepped inside. He held a sleek silver tablet in his hand, his expression reflecting the quiet satisfaction of a job executed flawlessly. The federal regulatory agencies have formally acknowledged receipt of our final audit report, Kira, he stated, taking a seat across from my desk. The SEC lead investigator reached out this morning. They were incredibly impressed with the depth and clarity of the documentation we provided. It essentially handed them the entire wire fraud case on a silver platter. I offered Marcus a small, genuine smile. Thank you, Marcus. Your team did exceptional work under incredibly difficult circumstances. Ensure that all of our internal files regarding this matter are archived and sealed according to standard legal protocols. We are entirely finished with that firm. As Marcus nodded and exited the room, the private line on my desk phone began to flash. It was a muted, pulsing red light, indicating a new voicemail message. I already knew who was calling. They had been calling all week, their desperation escalating with every new breaking news segment and every frozen bank account. I reached out and tapped the speaker button, leaning back and resting my hands on my lap. The audio filled the quiet room. It was Howard first, his voice completely stripped of the booming, arrogant authority he had wielded like a weapon for my entire life. Kira, please pick up the phone, he begged, the sound of sheer panic vibrating through the speaker. The FBI was at the office today. They took everything. They locked the doors. The banks will not let me access a single dollar. We cannot pay the staff. We cannot hire a lawyer. You have to call the SEC. You have to tell them you made a mistake on the audit. You are the only one who can explain this away. Please, Kira. I am your father. You cannot let them destroy me. The message ended, immediately followed by the sharp beep of the next voicemail. This time, the shrill, weeping voice echoed through my office. Kira, how can you be doing this to us? She sobbed, the sound wet and frantic. Felicity is having a complete nervous breakdown. Trent will not return her calls, and the police came to her apartment this morning to ask questions. She is terrified, Kira. We have no money left. The country club suspended our membership because our auto payment bounced. The neighbors are staring at us. You have to fix this. You have the money. You have the connections. You have to come home and save your family. I listened to their frantic, miserable voices, waiting for the familiar heavy wave of guilt that had plagued my childhood. I waited to feel the crushing obligation to sacrifice my own well-being to protect them from the consequences of their actions. I waited to feel the instinctive urge to rush to their rescue, to patch the holes in their sinking ship, and to wrap Felicity in a protective blanket of my own accomplishments. But as the final voicemail ended and the room returned to absolute silence, the heavy wave of guilt never arrived. Instead, a profound, unshakable sense of peace settled deep into my bones. The silence was not empty. It was the sound of absolute freedom. I did not feel a single shred of responsibility for the disaster they were currently experiencing. They were adults who had made a series of incredibly toxic illegal choices, and the universe was finally delivering the receipt. I leaned forward and tapped a few buttons on the digital console of my desk phone. With a smooth, decisive motion, I forwarded the entire batch of desperate voicemails directly to my corporate legal team. I typed a quick professional note, instructing my attorneys to retain the audio files as documented proof of their continued attempts to coerce me into participating in a federal cover-up. Then I permanently blocked their phone numbers from reaching my personal line ever again. I stood up from my chair and walked toward the massive window, looking out over the vibrant, bustling city that I had conquered on my own terms. The toxic cycle of emotional manipulation was forever broken. The golden child was finally facing reality, and the lifelong enablers were trapped in the wreckage they created with their own two hands. I took a deep, clean breath of the conditioned air, feeling remarkably lighter than I had in 30 long years. I went straight back to work. This was my life now, peaceful, prosperous, and completely mine. The show was finally over for them all. While I enjoyed the quiet hum of my corporate sanctuary, a very different kind of reality was crashing down across town. Felicity was finally experiencing the real world without our parents' wealth or my silent competence to shield her from the consequences of her own actions. The federal freeze on the family bank accounts had hit her luxury high-rise condo first. She had spent the last 3 years living in a sprawling, meticulously decorated penthouse suite overlooking the harbor, a property she had leased using a dummy corporate account funded entirely by stolen money. When the authorities locked down the logistics firm, that account was immediately flagged and suspended. The direct deposit for her exorbitant monthly rent bounced, and the property management group wasted absolutely no time delivering an emergency eviction notice. For the first 48 hours after the disastrous dinner at the country club, Felicity had remained trapped in a state of frantic, hysterical denial. According to the updates my legal team gathered from the ongoing federal filings, she had spent the entire weekend desperately trying to contact Trent Sterling. She called his personal cell phone, his corporate office line, and even his executive assistant. She sent dozens of frantic text messages begging for a chance to explain, swearing that the forensic audit was a lie and that I had maliciously set her up. Trent never responded to a single message. He had walked out of that dining room and permanently deleted her from his life with the ruthless efficiency of a seasoned venture capitalist cutting a bad investment. The Sterling family completely scrubbed any mention of the upcoming wedding from their social circles, canceling the historic venue and the elite caterers with quiet, brutal speed. There would be no society wedding, no magazine feature, and no rescue. Without Trent's prestigious name attached to hers, and with the federal indictments making front-page news on every local financial network, the illusion of Felicity's elite status evaporated instantly. She had spent millions of stolen dollars carefully cultivating a circle of wealthy, influential friends. She had bought their loyalty with endless rounds of expensive champagne, exclusive weekend trips to coastal resorts, and lavish gifts purchased on the company dime. She genuinely believed these women were her lifelong confidants who admired her grace and style. But high society operates on a strict currency of reputation and utility, and Felicity was suddenly bankrupt in both. When the reality of her frozen bank accounts finally set in, she started scrolling through her phone, desperately calling the women she had treated to thousands of dollars in spa days just weeks prior. She needed a place to stay. She needed a massive loan to hire a competent criminal defense attorney. She needed someone to validate her victim complex. But every single call went straight to voicemail. The text messages she sent were left unread or met with polite, icy rejections claiming sudden schedule conflicts. The women who had practically lived in her penthouse when the champagne was flowing freely suddenly treated her like a highly contagious disease. They untagged themselves from photos with her on social media and blocked her number, terrified that any association with a federally indicted embezzler would taint their own carefully curated reputations. She was completely isolated, abandoned by the very people she had committed felonies to impress. The eviction process was swift and utterly humiliating. On Tuesday morning, building security arrived at her penthouse door with formal notice to vacate the premises immediately. Felicity threw a spectacular tantrum in the marble hallway, screaming at the property manager and threatening to sue the building for emotional distress and public defamation. But her threats were entirely hollow, and the building staff knew it. They had read the breaking news. They knew she had absolutely no money to hire a lawyer, and no powerful father left to intimidate them into backing down. She was given exactly 4 hours to pack her personal belongings and surrender the keys to the exclusive unit. For a woman whose entire identity was tied to material wealth and designer brand names, the packing process was a psychological breaking point. She was forced to stuff her remaining clothing, her imported silk shoes, and her everyday jewelry into ordinary cardboard boxes provided by the building superintendent. The federal agents had already seized the most valuable items purchased directly with stolen corporate funds, leaving her with only the remnants of her older wardrobe and a few personal items. She dragged the heavy boxes down to the service elevator, her manicured hands blistering from the rough cardboard, while the building staff watched with expressions of thinly veiled disgust. There were no eager valets waiting to assist her, no polite doorman offering sympathetic smiles. She was just another evicted tenant being ushered out the back door to avoid disturbing the paying residents. She stood on the concrete loading dock behind the luxury building, surrounded by the pathetic cardboard boxes containing her entire ruined life. Her parents could not help her. Howard and Catherine were currently dealing with their own immediate eviction from the family estate, their assets entirely frozen by the Securities and Exchange Commission. The logistics empire was in receivership, their country club memberships were revoked, and they were scrambling to secure public defenders for their impending court dates. They were too consumed by their own spectacular downfall to offer their golden child a soft place to land. With no money for a luxury hotel and no friends willing to answer her calls, Felicity was forced to hire a cheap local moving van with the last few $100s she had hidden in a personal cash drawer. She directed the driver to a dilapidated weekly rental motel on the extreme outskirts of the city, a place with flickering neon signs and stained exterior walls. It was the only accommodation that did not require a credit check or a massive security deposit. As she carried her boxes into the dingy, smoke-scented room, the sheer magnitude of her failure finally crushed the last remaining fragments of her manufactured arrogance. There was no plush velvet sofa to fall onto, only a lumpy mattress covered in a scratchy polyester bedspread. There was no panoramic view of the harbor, only a small dirty window looking out over a cracked asphalt parking lot filled with rusted vehicles. She sat on the edge of the bed, wearing a wrinkled designer dress that now looked ridiculous in the cheap motel lighting, and stared at the blank screen of her phone. No one was calling to rescue her. Trent was gone. Her wealthy friends were gone. The endless stream of stolen money that had funded her delusion was gone forever. She had spent 30 years believing she was fundamentally superior to everyone around her simply because our parents had handed her the crown. She had treated me like a disposable servant, treated the company accounts like her personal piggy bank, and treated the law like a minor inconvenience that did not apply to someone with her perfect blonde hair and winning smile. Now she was staring directly at a federal prison sentence completely stripped of the gilded armor that had protected her entire existence. The golden child had finally fallen from the pedestal, and the impact had shattered her completely. There was no more manipulating the truth, no more blaming me for her mistakes, and absolutely no way out of the dark, miserable reality she had built for herself. The isolation was absolute, and the crushing consequences of her monumental greed were only just beginning to unfold. She was finally going to learn what it meant to survive in a world where she was entirely unremarkable, completely alone and no longer protected by the family name she had destroyed. I was reviewing a quarterly projection report when the private line on my mahogany desk chimed. It was Sarah, my lead receptionist in the main lobby. Her normally composed voice carried a faint trace of uncertainty. She informed me that an older man claiming to be my father was standing at the front desk, requesting an urgent audience. He did not have an appointment, and he was refusing to leave the premises until he spoke directly with me. I set my silver pen down, a profound sense of calm washing over me. Just a few short weeks ago, a surprise visit from Howard would have sent my heart racing with a desperate hope for validation. Now I felt absolutely nothing but mild clinical curiosity. I calmly instructed Sarah to have him wait by the glass atrium and explicitly told her not to issue him a guest pass. I stood up, smoothed the crisp lines of my tailored charcoal suit, and confidently walked out of my penthouse suite. I took the private elevator down to the ground floor. When the polished steel doors slid open, the expansive, brilliantly sunlit lobby stretched out before me. Standing awkwardly near the center of this architectural dominance was Howard. In just a matter of weeks, the formidable, incredibly arrogant patriarch who had terrorized my entire childhood had vanished completely. He looked remarkably aged, his shoulders slumped heavily beneath a designer suit that suddenly seemed a full size too large for his rapidly diminishing frame. The booming, untouchable confidence that had always served as his primary armor was entirely stripped away. I approached him slowly, my high heels clicking a steady rhythm against the immaculate white marble floor. He turned to face me. His eyes were now bloodshot and brimming with a pathetic manufactured sorrow. He took a tentative step, raising his shaking hands in complete surrender, clearly intimidated by the sheer magnitude of the corporate empire his scapegoat daughter had constructed. Kira, he began, his voice lacking its signature booming resonance. It sounded thin and desperate. Thank you for coming down. I know you are incredibly busy, but I had to speak with you. I stopped exactly 6 feet away from him, maintaining a rigid professional distance. I simply stood there, an immovable force of nature. I wanted him to feel the absolute power disparity, to understand that he was standing in my domain. State your business. Howard, I said, my tone as cool and detached as if I were addressing a vendor who had missed a shipment. He flinched. Kira, please, he pleaded, dropping his gaze before forcing himself to look at me again. The federal prosecutors are not offering any leniency. The bankruptcy proceedings have stripped us of everything we owned. We are losing the house by the end of the month. Your mother is falling apart, and Felicity is facing actual prison time. We have absolutely nothing left. I remained impassive. That sounds like a comprehensive summary of consequences, I noted evenly. But it does not explain why you are standing in my lobby. Howard swallowed hard. He took a deep, shaky breath, desperately attempting to summon his old patriarchal authority, but it dissolved instantly under my cold and unwavering stare. I came here to apologize, he said, his voice suddenly cracking. I came to tell you that I was entirely wrong. We made terrible mistakes, Kira. We were so caught up in maintaining an image that we completely failed to see what was happening right in front of us. We failed to see your true value. I made massive mistakes as a father, and I am truly sorry. He looked at me with wide, pleading eyes, waiting for his words to work. For 30 years, his apologies were simply tactical maneuvers designed to restore his control. He believed that acknowledging a vague error would act as a universal reset button, forcing me back into the role of the dutiful daughter who would save him from the wreckage of his own spectacular incompetence. I let the silence hang in the air for a long, agonizing minute. I watched the desperate hope flickering in his eyes slowly curdle into dread as my expression remained entirely unchanged. There was absolutely no mercy. An apology isn't a strategy, Dad. I said the words slicing through the air, devoid of any warmth. It is just noise. It is a desperate public relations tactic from a man whose ship has already hit the bottom. Howard opened his mouth to protest, a flash of his old temper briefly illuminating his exhausted features, but I cut him off smoothly. You did not make a mistake, I continued. A mistake is a miscalculation, a temporary lapse in judgment. What you did was an active, deliberate campaign. You made a choice. Every single day for 30 years you woke up and made the conscious choice to elevate Felicity and diminish me. You chose to fund her delusions while ridiculing my ambitions. You chose to ignore the financial hemorrhaging in your company because you preferred the comfortable lie over the difficult truth. Those were not mistakes, Howard. They were the foundational building blocks of your entire life. He stared at me, his mouth slightly open, the remaining color draining from his face. The realization that his carefully constructed narrative had been completely obliterated finally settled over him. He was standing completely exposed. I am your father, he whispered, a final pathetic attempt to play a card that had lost its value long ago. You cannot just leave us. We are family. The concept of family requires mutual respect, protection, and unconditional support, I explained calmly. You provided none of those things. You spent my entire life teaching me that transactions are the only currency that matters. You taught me to value competence, to ruthlessly eliminate liabilities, and to protect my assets at all costs. I am simply applying the exact lessons you instilled in me. You are a massive liability, and I am cutting my losses. He physically recoiled, the devastating truth hitting him with undeniable force. He opened his mouth, searching for a rebuttal, a plea, a demand. But there was nothing left to say. I turned my attention away from him. I caught the eye of Marcus, my head of corporate security, who had been monitoring the interaction. He immediately stepped forward, his imposing presence a stark contrast to my father's defeated posture. Marcus, I said clearly, this man is no longer permitted on the premises. If he attempts to enter this building again, or if he attempts to contact any of my staff, you are to notify local law enforcement immediately and file formal trespassing charges. Revoke his building access permanently. Understood, Ms. Wilson, Marcus replied, stepping smoothly between me and my father. Howard let out a choked, ragged sound, a mixture of a sob and a gasp of sheer panic. Kira, please, you cannot do this. I have nowhere else to go. I did not look back. I turned on my heel and walked steadily toward the private elevator. The rhythmic clicking of my heels echoed through the lobby, a steady march toward my own future. As the heavy steel doors slid shut, sealing me away from the toxic remnants of the past, I caught one final glimpse of Howard. He was being firmly escorted toward the glass doors by my security team, a broken old man being ushered out of an empire he could never control. I pressed the button for the penthouse, feeling a profound, unshakable lightness spreading through my chest. The final boundary had been drawn. The golden child was falling, the arrogant patriarch was now completely broken, and I finally knew that I was exactly where I was always meant to be. Exactly 6 months melted away after that final encounter in the lobby of my building. Half a year of uninterrupted peace, steady growth, and profound personal transformation. The transition from the biting chill of that turbulent winter into the vibrant, blossoming warmth of early summer mirrored the shift within my own soul. I had spent 33 years of my life bracing for impact, constantly anticipating the next insult, the next demand, or the next elaborate manipulation from the people who were supposed to protect me. Now, stepping into my 34th year, my shoulders were permanently relaxed. The chronic low-grade anxiety that had buzzed in the back of my mind since childhood was completely gone, replaced by a deep, unshakable certainty. I had built a fortress of my own design, and absolutely no one held the keys but me. Tonight was my 34th birthday. 10 years ago, Catherine had canceled my 23rd birthday dinner because Felicity had broken a nail and demanded their undivided attention. Howard had told me to be the strong one, as if my ability to endure neglect somehow gave them permission to keep inflicting it. I had spent that night sitting alone in a cheap studio apartment, eating a cold takeout meal, and desperately trying to convince myself that my feelings of rejection were just me being selfish. Tonight the contrast was so stark, it almost felt like another lifetime. I had rented the entire rooftop conservatory of an exclusive glass-walled restaurant overlooking the harbor. The space was breathtaking, filled with lush greenery, warmly glowing string lights, and the soft, sophisticated hum of live jazz music floating through the warm evening air. The tables were draped in crisp white linen, and the air was thick with the rich, inviting aromas of roasted garlic, seared scallops, and expensive wine. I was not sitting alone at an empty table waiting for people who would never arrive. I was surrounded by a vibrant, joyous crowd of 50 people who had chosen to be there simply because they valued my presence. These were my loyal colleagues, the brilliant men and women who stood beside me every single day at Apex Solutions. There was David, my lead forensic accountant, who was currently debating vintage watches with my chief legal counsel. There was Sarah, my steadfast receptionist, laughing brightly in a stunning emerald dress, completely relaxed outside the corporate environment. Beyond my staff, there were the genuine friends I had cultivated over the years. These were fellow entrepreneurs, mentors, and peers who knew nothing of the scapegoat narrative my parents had tried to force upon me. They only knew Kira Wilson, the fiercely competent, fiercely loyal woman who built her success entirely with her own two hands. They were the family I had actively chosen, bound not by the random luck of genetics or the toxic chains of obligation, but by mutual respect, shared values, and authentic affection. As the evening flowed seamlessly from a lavish dinner into dessert, the atmosphere in the room grew even warmer. The waitstaff moved gracefully among the guests, pouring vintage champagne into crystal flutes. Marcus stepped to the center of the room, gently tapping his spoon against his glass to command the attention of the crowd. The conversations quieted down, and 50 faces turned toward him with genuine smiles. He raised his glass in my direction, his expression reflecting the deep professional and personal respect we had forged through countless high-stakes corporate battles. I want to propose a toast to our fearless leader, our visionary, and our dear friend, Kira Marcus, began his voice carrying easily across the quiet rooftop. I have watched this woman navigate challenges that would have completely broken most seasoned executives. I have watched her build an empire on the foundational principles of absolute integrity, relentless hard work, and brilliant strategy. But more importantly, I have watched her lift up everyone around her. She does not demand loyalty through fear. She earns it through unyielding support and unparalleled competence. Kira, you have created a space where excellence is the standard and compassion is the rule. We are all incredibly lucky to be in your orbit. Happy 34th birthday. May this year bring you exactly the kind of peace and prosperity you so richly deserve. A chorus of cheers and heartfelt applause erupted from the crowd. Glasses clinked together and warm smiles were directed my way from every corner of the room. I felt a sudden profound swell of emotion tightening my throat, but they were not tears of sorrow or rejection. They were tears of pure, unadulterated gratitude. I raised my own glass in acknowledgement, mouthing a sincere thank you to Marcus and the rest of the room. This was what true validation felt like. It was not a transactional reward granted for making someone else look good. It was the organic, beautiful result of showing up authentically in the world and doing the hard, necessary work to build a life of genuine substance. I stepped away from the center of the room for a brief moment, moving toward the sleek, curved bar tucked away in the quieter lounge area of the conservatory. I simply wanted a moment to catch my breath and let the sheer beauty of the evening soak into my bones. Behind the polished marble bar, a large flat-screen television was mounted on the wall, muted with subtitles scrolling across the bottom of the screen. The bartender was busy mixing cocktails for a few guests at the other end, leaving me standing alone in front of the silent broadcast. My eyes naturally drifted toward the screen, just as the local financial news network transitioned to a breaking story. The banner across the bottom read in stark, bold letters, "Apex Logistics enters final liquidation phase." A photograph of my father looking dramatically aged and thoroughly defeated flashed across the screen. It was followed by footage of federal agents placing padlock seals on the heavy glass doors of the massive corporate headquarters he had prized above his own family. The subtitles rapidly summarized the complete dismantling of the empire. Remaining assets were auctioned off to pay federal restitution. Felicity was currently serving a 36-month sentence in a federal penitentiary. My parents were facing personal bankruptcy and total social exile. I stood there holding my crystal flute, reading the absolute destruction of their lives playing out in silent detail. I waited for the surge of vindictive triumph to hit me, but I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional cord keeping me tied to their dysfunction had dissolved into dust. I turned my back to the television screen, permanently breaking my gaze away from their liquidation. I looked back out over the vibrant, glowing rooftop conservatory where the jazz band was playing. Sarah was laughing joyously at a joke someone had told her, head thrown back in pure delight. Marcus was waving me over to join a conversation with a group of my favorite clients. The warm, inviting energy of my chosen family beckoned to me entirely separate from the wreckage of the past. The ultimate revenge wasn't just exposing them, it was achieving complete untouchable indifference to their existence. The sweetest revenge is rarely a loud, explosive confrontation. As we have seen in this journey from being the family's discarded scapegoat to becoming an untouchable success. True vindication does not come from destroying those who hurt you. It comes from completely outgrowing them. When you spend your life being diminished, unfairly compared, and treated as an afterthought by the very people who are supposed to protect you, it is dangerously easy to internalize that toxic narrative. You might start to believe your worth is permanently tied to their conditional approval. But the most powerful lesson here is that your value is inherent, and your future is entirely in your own hands. True independence is the ultimate weapon. It is built quietly through late nights, unwavering determination, and an absolute refusal to accept the role of the permanent victim. When the moment of truth finally arrives, when the hidden extent of your success is revealed to those who doubted you, the goal is not just to watch your antagonists face the consequences of their greed. The true goal is realizing that you no longer need their validation to feel whole. You learn that holding on to anger only keeps you tethered to their dysfunction. By redirecting that intense energy into building your own empire, whether that is a thriving career, a peaceful home, or a chosen family of genuine friends, you break the generational cycle forever. The ultimate triumph is reaching a point where their opinions, their downfalls, and their desperate attempts to pull you back simply do not matter anymore. Absolute indifference is the crown of the true victor. Have you ever had to break free from a toxic environment to build your own success story? How did you find the courage to walk away and create your own peace? Share your journey in the comments below. If this story of reclaiming your power resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more empowering tales. Remember, your success